All right, everyone. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for this session. My name is Christina Clement. I'm joining you from Kennesaw, Georgia, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm very glad to welcome Lori Birrell, who will be presenting Show Me the Money, applying an equity lens to the budget process. But before we get started, I want to go over a few logistical items. This session is being recorded. Captions are available during this session by clicking on the live CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And thank you to Jason Cunningham for providing these. Please use the Q&A feature for any presentation questions. You can choose to do this anonymously if you wish. There will be about 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat for any general comments or technical issues. Joanna Kimmett is here today, and she's going to be monitoring the chat for any questions and comments related to tech or just general things. Joanna is also going to be adding some links into the chat. One is for the collaborative resource sharing. So if you think of a related reading, podcast, video, or something else, please share it with us in the columns recommended resources sharing Zotero. There is also a link for our conference code of conduct, which we recommend that you review if you haven't already done so. So with that, I am now going to go off camera so I can turn things over to Lori. Lori, please take it away.
Great, thanks so much. Just going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. My name is Lori Birrell, and I am Director for Special Collections and Museums at the University of Delaware. So to get us started today, I'm hoping that you can kind of tell me sort of where you're at with this topic. So using the chat, I'm hoping that you'll share what words come to mind when you think of the work of managing budgets. So just take 30 seconds or so to do that. Oh, I see some tough words coming up. Complex puzzle, red tape. All right, thank you so much for sharing. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. So as I mentioned, I work at the University of Delaware, and this is the third institution I've worked at and the third role that I've had where budget management is a part of my job. I started my career as a manuscripts curator, and I oversaw a couple of acquisitions accounts as well as a digital project budget. And I don't know about you, but I did not learn how to manage budgets in library school. I remember maybe a brief mention of that in a kind of general management class, but by and large, that topic was definitely not discussed. And so I see that someone in the chat described this as a puzzle, and I feel the same way. Oftentimes I feel like I've been on some kind of quest or journey to put the budget puzzle together at each institution that I've worked at. And once more, as I continue to be surprised by the lack of transparency around communicating around the budget, around the money that we have available to do the work that we're being asked to do. Since I was first managing that acquisitions and project budget, I've since gone on to be a department head and a library administrator. And while a certain amount of transparency has happened as I've moved up in kind of the organizational hierarchy into these more senior roles, I've found that I have to really be the one to push in many cases for this kind of transparency and communication around the budget and available funds. Along the way, I've created a toolkit of sorts, which I'll be sharing with you today, that has really helped me to have what can often be a difficult or even fraught conversations with some of my colleagues and stakeholders as I've tried to suss out what's going on with the budget. And so I'll be sharing the details of that toolkit with you today. And throughout the session, there'll be opportunities for you to apply different parts of the toolkit to your particular budget context. So to my mind, to create a culture in academic libraries that really prioritizes transparency and clear communication when it comes to the budget, I've developed 4 guiding principles that make up this toolkit. I truly believe that transparency around the budget and clear communication about it are equity issues. Unless we know how much money we have, whose role it is to spend it, and what decisions they're making and why to spend the money, we really can't have equitable and inclusive institutions. And that's the frame that I bring to this work. So the 4 guiding principles are here on the screen, and I'll just read them out. The first is knowing where your money is and what it can be spent on. The second is developing a budget strategy to support your program and key objectives. The third is communicating both internally within your unit and externally to stakeholders on how you've spent your funds. And then the fourth is writing a funding proposal to gain additional support from library administrators or outside funders. It's my firm belief that no matter where you sit in the organizational hierarchy or what role you have, that you deserve to know what funds are available to support the work that you do and where those funds come from, and how to ask for more or different kinds of funding as the work you do evolves. It's my hope that after this session, you'll have the tools you need to feel more confident going on your own budget quest to put the puzzle together at your institution, and how to leverage the skills needed to effectively manage the budget to support your work. As we dive into this topic, a brief note on some vocabulary to pay attention to as you consider your own budget context. There are primarily three types of budget funds to be aware of, and I've listed those here on the screen. The first are endowments, and these are invested funds that often come to a library as part of an estate gift or other type of financial planning. These accounts generate a certain amount of revenue from the principal each year, typically around 4%, and that's the amount of money that you have available to spend. Oftentimes endowments have certain stipulations, like they can only be spent on a particular type of expense, like student assistantships. And so you want to be sure you understand what those stipulations are. The second type of fund are gift funds, and unlike endowments, these are one-time monies. So once you spend these monies, they don't regenerate every year. Similar to endowments, they often have stipulations associated with them as well, or stem from a certain type of fundraising campaign, like digitizing the student yearbook or some other initiative. The third category, that name can change depending on the type of institution you work in. But by and large, these are kind of your general operating funds. These are monies that come from either a tuition or student fee. If you're at a private institution, sometimes individual colleges are actually taxed, and that tax comes to the library. Or if you work at a public institution, you're often getting a state appropriation of some kind. So those are your sort of general operating funds that are typically used for things like salary, as well as collection resources. The next foundational element to be aware of are the people who are there to support you as you do the work of managing budgets. So you want to think about the different staff roles associated with budget management. Most academic libraries have a budget officer. That person is sometimes a standalone role, or sometimes the person is responsible for HR or other types of work in addition to managing the budget. If you're new to your library, new to your role, or even if you've worked in your institution for a while, I strongly encourage you to meet with that senior budget officer. They will have really the most information to share with you about how budgets are conceived of at your institution. This person can provide important insights into the overall model and how budgeting works at your institution, both at the library level and at the institution level. They can also help to you to get familiar with the budget system, so the software and the different tools that are used at your institution, which often vary. Next, if there's a second person in your library who has responsibility for aspects of the budget or kind of finance work, I suggest that you meet with them as well, but I like to meet with that person separately and after I've met with that senior budget officer. This second person is often responsible for actually processing orders, so whether those are supply orders, things like that, but they are kind of the final check before an order can actually be processed. And so building a strong relationship with that person is very helpful, especially as you think about managing and tracking your own spending throughout the year. Then the third type of role to become familiar with is development, sometimes referred to as advancement or alumni relations. These are folks who are responsible for fundraising. And so what you want to do is you want to find out if there is someone in your library who has that role. Sometimes a library has someone who's just working for them. Other times you'd be working with someone in central development or some other office on campus. And the reason you want to talk with that person is you want to find out if their fundraising priorities intersect with your budget area or kind of your work area. So this is most common in acquisitions and special collections and archives. And if there is that connection, you want to start to develop that and strengthen that relationship as well, because you'll want to partner with this person as you go about spending out money that they have likely raised for your units. So those are the two main roles, or three types of staff member who you might encounter. All right, so now that you've learned a little bit about the types of funds that you're likely to see and the people that you'll be working with, let's go ahead and dig into Toolkit step number 1, knowing where your money is and what it can be spent on. It's been my experience at each of the 3 institutions I've worked at and then the 3 roles I've had that people don't know what you don't know. I haven't really experienced outright resistance to my quest for knowing where the money is and what it can be spent on. But throughout my career, I've encountered a certain amount of legend and folklore that had to be debunked for me to effectively spend and manage my accounts. So one example of such lore was a particular endowment that people believed could only be spent on a certain department's collection development work, when in fact the language of the gift agreement included no such stipulation. Once I could debunk this myth, I was then able to allocate a certain amount of this generous endowment to this other department in support of their acquisitions. And that real allocation helped to change the narrative that that department had about itself, namely that it was undervalued and undersupported and underfunded. I share that example to illustrate how powerful knowing where the money is and what it can be spent on as you think about creating equitable work environments, inclusive work environments where work is valued and people feel as though you are supporting them financially. This step is really key. So how do you go about finding where your money is and what it can be spent on? First, no matter if you're new in your role or not, if you're expected to manage a part of a budget, an account, a fund, you want to take the time to meet with that budget officer or that development officer, or if possible, even your predecessor, to walk you through these available accounts and what makes up these accounts. It's true that during this process, you may encounter some frustration from your colleagues, past or present. At a previous institution, I found that my budget officer was happy to talk to me about the accounts I had available to me, but was very frustrated that my predecessor hadn't left me the binder that he remembered creating for her with printouts of descriptions of all the accounts. And so know that people came before you, and so this work may have already been done, but maybe wasn't documented in such a way that you'll benefit from. So I always, suggest do your future self a favor, do your successors a favor, and document the outcomes of your quest. Document what these accounts are and what they can be spent on so that you have a reminder of it and those who come after you do. Then we all benefit from this kind of transparency. So for example, when I left my previous 2 institutions, I wrote a short report that really outlined the budget strategy that I had, and we'll talk about strategy in a minute, as well as the key pieces of information and the places to find that information so the person could kind of pick that strategy up and continue to work with it. If at all possible, as you're starting on this journey, you want to ask for copies of any kind of documentation that exists. That documentation is most common for endowments and gift funds. And again, because those accounts typically have stipulations associated with them, you want to be sure you know what those guardrails really are. And that'll help you form your strategy, which is the second part of the toolkit. So what does it sound like to start to ask these questions and gather this information? Since most of the funds I manage tend to be endowments or gift funds, I typically work closely with development when starting a new job to kind of find out the relevant information. So on the screen is an email I sent to our development officer last summer as I was getting started. And as you can see, it's very brief. It's kind of to the point. I had made a list of the accounts that I wanted to know more about. I had asked, for them to gather that documentation for me. And then we set up a time to meet and talk more about it. During that meeting, I asked clarifying questions about the documentation I had been sent, so I was sure I was clearly understanding what I was reading and the kind of latitude I had. Often with these sorts of gift agreements, you want to understand if your institution follows more of a letter of the law approach or a spirit of the law approach. And that definitely differs at each institution as to how closely they follow the exact wording of the gift agreements. And so understanding that, again, helps to inform your budget strategy. The other thing I talked to the development officer about was any reporting requirements her office has. And again, this is specific to endowments primarily, where once a year development will write what are referred to as stewardship reports. And that lets the donor and or their descendants know how you spent the money that year. So tracking spending is part of the toolkit. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that kind of tracking will feed into this information that you then give the development officer if that's what's being required. And I like to gather that information throughout the year, so I'm not scrambling as that deadline comes up to provide that information. Another important part of knowing where your money is learning the system that your institution uses for tracking its spending. I've never encountered a simple or a flawless system, I'm sorry to report, so don't be disappointed if the one you have to learn frustrates you. I once worked at an institution that used the color red and parentheses to indicate positive amounts and black text to indicate negatives or outflows, which I found to be a real mind twister. Oftentimes you'll see that your institution has trainings or tutorials that you can avail yourself of, and I strongly recommend that you do that. Just because these systems are clunky doesn't mean that that's an excuse for not knowing how to use them and being able to track and manage your funds. Another key aspect of this part of the toolkit is tracking your spending throughout the year. So I like to set calendar reminders and run regular reports so that I can see how I'm doing on my spending. And then I use those figures to project my division's needs for the coming year or to make adjustments as the year goes on. And I'll talk a bit more about that reporting later on. These reports are also a helpful way of picking up mistakes that can happen. So maybe your account got mistakenly charged for something. And so again, that kind of tracking can help you find those errors. I once discovered that none of our supplies, for example, were being charged to our right account. And so it looked like we were underspending that category, which is just as much of a problem as overspending is sometimes. And so if you're tracking your spending, correcting that error can be pretty straightforward because you found it sooner rather than later. So first you want to, of course, double check with the person who's making those purchases that they have the right account number. And then if they do, you want to start to have a conversation with your budget officer about what may be happening in the approval process. By and large, if an account is mistakenly charged, as long as you catch that, it can often be easily corrected during the fiscal year and sometimes even after the fiscal year has closed. So let's go ahead and pause here. I've shared a lot of information at this point, and I'm kind of curious to understand from you, and just sort of you can just share your thoughts in the chat. I'm curious to understand kind of what your comfort level might be with starting on your own quest of knowing where your money is and what it can be spent on. If you're not feeling confident, do you have any thoughts about how you might kind of increase your confidence in this area? So just take a minute and feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. Yeah, persistence is key. Absolutely. Yep, it definitely takes time, Beth. Absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing, and please continue to add your thoughts to the chat. Whoops, I guess I had a slide for that one. All right. All right, so now that you know where your money is and what it can be spent on, it's time to create your budget strategy. And that's the second step in the toolkit. So the two guiding questions that I like to consider at this point are, what do you need to spend money on and what do you want to spend your money on? And I like to distinguish between these two types of spending categories because in most cases there are core operational expenses that you have to meet your mission and to do the work that you've been charged to do. And then there are things that fall into kind of a nice to have category. So an example of a core operational expense for me has been having students to staff our service point. And so that's a core operational expense. A nice to have might be partnering with a unit on campus to co-sponsor a program. It's worth noting that depending on the work that you do, the institution you work at, your mileage may certainly vary. So the examples I'm giving may not directly apply to you, but they're just to give you an idea. The purpose of taking this approach, so asking these two particular questions, is to be able to clearly articulate for yourself as well as for the people who you work with what funding you need to do what you've been tasked to do and what would enable you to offer a value add. These categories, of course, should support your objectives, both short and long term. For example, providing hands-on learning opportunities has been a goal of mine at each institution I've worked at. And we know that not all students can afford to take an unpaid internship, nor should we be asking them to do that. So at my previous institution, after learning that students could receive both academic credit and an hourly wage to do a student internship, for the next fiscal year, we worked to allocate funds in our budget to provide 3 paid internships. And these were opportunities that provided really great pathways or help students understand rather the pathways into cultural heritage work. So that's just one example of how you can then use these sorts of categories to augment and support your goals. Once you've got those 2 lists of core operational expenses and those nice to have expenses, you want to, of course, share those categories of expenses with your team. Whether or not you're new in your position or new to managing a budget, it's certainly been true for me that the more you involve others, especially those who are closest to the actual daily work of your unit, the more you involve them in developing your strategy, the more accurate and realistic a picture it's going to be as you start to create that strategy. So again, you want to involve people as early in your planning process as possible. So send them the list of those categories, set up a time to talk to kind of do a bit of a check with them. Does this make sense? Depending on your department's culture, maybe you want to create these lists together as opposed to doing it separately and then sharing with them. Those are just some suggestions. Since participating in the budget process may be new for some staff, you want to be clear about why you're asking for their feedback, what kind of experience and expertise they're bringing to the process. And also you want to be clear about how you're going to use their input, if at all. Hopefully you are, but if for whatever reason you're not, you want to be clear so that they understand their role in the process. And this kind of transparency will help to increase the trust that others have in you as the person managing their budgets. So on the screen is an example of how I've thought about these 2 categories. So core operational expenses were student employees to staff our service point, being able to pay for supplies and software to do our work. And that nice to have category were co-sponsored events and co-sponsorships and staff initiated events. It's worth saying that at no 2 institutions have we thought about the budget in the same way. I've worked places where supplies are managed centrally through the vice provost's office or through our budget officer's office. Sometimes I've managed it through an endowment or some kind of operational fund. So again, your mileage may vary, but once you know where your money is and what it can be spent on, you then can start to put things together as you develop your strategy. So using the chat, I'd love to hear what some of your nice to haves and must haves are. People, yes, salaries, absolutely. Professional development, that's a great one. Collection budget, yep. Furniture, yeah. Instructional software. New tech, yeah. Great, thank you so much. So now with these categories in mind, it's time to put some dollars and cents on the page. When it comes to your student or other salary categories, there are a few tips that I'd offer that you want to keep in mind. So first, you want to find out if there are any minimum wage increases happening in your state. Oftentimes, these increases happen during the middle of an academic fiscal year. So they tend to happen in January, whereas our fiscal year typically runs from July to June. So with that in mind, I like to calculate the student wage based on that increased amount, as opposed to having to calculate two wages, and then I have some built-in wiggle room into the budget. You also want to consider if there's a raise structure in your library for student or hourly workers. Oftentimes, each semester a student works, they get a 10-cent or other type of raise. And so you'll want to factor that in as you start to calculate the funds that you need. And certainly when you're thinking about your student part of the budget, don't put the onus entirely on yourself to determine these rates. This is a great opportunity to involve your student supervisors, especially if that person isn't you, in calculating what these rates will be. And so this is a great time, again, to include your team in this kind of work. And finally, my suggestion would be round up when it comes to wage allocations. I never want to be in a position with a student where I have to tell them, we can't pay you anymore because I goofed on the math and it's mid-semester. Of course, we never want to be in that kind of situation with any staff. So to avoid that, I always round up when I'm making a student or other type of wage allocation. So for example, if you think you need $10,250 for the year, maybe you put $11,000 on your spreadsheet just to include a bit of that room. If events are part of your budget, this is a great time to do some benchmarking with previous and similar events. Of course, you want to keep in mind escalating food costs or other type of labor expenses that maybe have changed since you last offered that similar program. If collections are part of your budget, unfortunately, we're in a constant state of inflation and increases when it comes to collection resources. So of course, you want to talk to your vendors and find out what likely increases you can expect for your subscriptions and other types of costs. And also to do a bit of listening on campus and find out if there are going to be new programs that you'll be expected to support and how your budget will be impacted because of that. Taking the time to do this kind of research will certainly help you make a more accurate projection of what your needs are for the coming year. Once you've finished making these projections, you want to send the draft to your staff or other key stakeholders who will be impacted by your strategy. You want to find out from them if what you've projected accurately reflects their needs for the coming fiscal year. You, of course, also want to know what expense categories may be missing. Maybe you left off furniture, but you know that you have new staff coming in and, of course, will need to outfit their offices. And finally, you want to ask if any priorities have changed since you began this process and what changes you may need to make to your budget model or strategy in response. Once you've finished incorporating this feedback, you want to add up those dollars and cents and ask yourself, do you in fact have the funds to support this anticipated program? And if not, what might you change, or where can you potentially find other sources of funding support to avoid cutting back? If you do cut back, how are you going to make those decisions? And perhaps most importantly, how will you then communicate those decisions to your team or other stakeholders? Now that you've done perhaps several iterations of your projected budget, circle back to your boss and or your budget officer as needed to be sure that you have their support for the allocation and the strategy that you've developed. Ideally, you'd have several conversations with them along the way as you're developing your strategy, so neither you nor they are surprised by the outcomes and what you're moving ahead with. The final step in this part of the toolkit is to communicate back to your team or key stakeholders that final projected budget. And you've heard me say projection or projection many times. And that's because I always emphasize with my team that the process we're using is intended to get as close as we can to an accurate picture that reflects our needs and where we're headed as a division. However, that kind of idealized state or picture may not, in fact, end up being realistic, and we may need to make changes throughout the year in response to unforeseen things. Our projection is based on the information we know at the moment, and so by building in some flexibility in your strategy and in your allocation, you can shift during the year as you start to track your spending and see how things are going. It's my hope that because folks tend to get anxious about the budget, that by talking about it as more of an iterative process, it's my hope that this lessens that anxiety and people understand that changes may be coming throughout the year. So that's something to consider as you go about making your own strategy. The third part of the toolkit is to regularly communicate to those within your unit and key stakeholders in your organization, like your boss or maybe your budget officer, how you're doing on spending your funds. The purpose of this kind of communication, especially with people in your reporting line, is to help others feel as though they're part of the budget process, which of course they are. You've included them at pretty much each step along the way. And so similar to how you sought their feedback when developing your strategy and projecting the dollars and cents you'd need to operationalize your plan, you want to include them throughout the year and let them know how things are going. For example, I run quarterly reports so I can track my spending in each of our accounts. And so I run those reports in September, January, April, and June. And then I share those reports with my department heads so that they can also see, they have direct access to this, but I make sure that they can see how we're doing on this spending. From here, though, it's important to construct a narrative around what these numbers are meaning, just like any kind of assessment. You want to see, if you're a little low on your spending or a little high, you want to understand why that's happening. You don't just want to kind of put that spreadsheet aside and go about your business for the rest of the quarter. So you want to think about what's happened that you're seeing these results. So for example, maybe you're underspending your student part of your budget, and maybe that's because you could only hire 3 students instead of the 5 that you projected. And so knowing that, maybe in the spring semester, you want to do a little bit more proactive recruitment or think differently about your hiring strategy. Or maybe you came across a great collection resource to buy that's going to support research and learning, and that's going to decrease the amount of money you have available throughout the rest of the year. So asking questions and kind of constructing a narrative around these reports will help you to discuss what you're seeing with others. Recently, my budget officer had expressed concern that our supplies spend was so far below what we had projected. And it's by running these reports and kind of interrogating what was going on that I realized that our supplies were actually being charged to the wrong account, and that's why it looked so low. And so having a strong relationship with the budget officer and their staff, we're able to figure out what's going on with that kind of accounting error and then fix it so that we get back on track. The other thing that these reports enable you to do is to figure out where you might have a little more money that you can spend on some unexpected things, excuse me. So when we get to January and February, I like to solicit one-time requests from the folks on my team. Often our expenses are recurring, things like salaries, collections, supplies. We know we'll need that money every year, and we'll need to allocate money for that every year. But there are expenses like equipment or perhaps certain types of software or conservation treatments that can be one-time purchases. You buy it once and then you're done. And so you talk with your team and brainstorm with them. What are some things they've maybe been holding off on that's on their wish list somewhere that you now have the money that you can spend money on, that you can spend on? When it comes to external communication, like with your boss or your budget officer, I tend to only report when something really good is going on or really bad. That's just my kind of personal preference. So what does something really bad look like? One year when I was early in my career, I was managing an acquisitions fund, and I realized that I had miscalculated a book dealer's fee, and I had overspent my fund and did not have enough money to cover this fee. So the first thing to note, if you've overspent, if the mistake is yours or someone in your reporting line, own up to it right away. Don't assume that things are magically going to work out or that no one will notice. It's much, much easier to fix a problem that's clearly defined than having to do financial forensics later on in the fiscal year to figure out what's happened. The second thing is, if the mistake isn't yours, like charging our supplies to the wrong account, make it clear that you're trying to figure out what's going on and that you're not blaming anyone, because that doesn't get you anywhere. So this can sound like, I talked with Sandy and she confirmed that she's using XYZ code to charge these supplies and she has invoices for such and such amount. Do you think it's possible that somewhere in the approval process, a different account number is being entered? And it's that, is it possible that shifts the conversation from blaming someone else who doesn't report to you to positing with this other supervisor what might be going on, and then you're solving a problem together. So what does things going really well with the budget look like? Well, it could be that an academic department is really interested in partnering with you, and so they've defrayed the cost of a student internship or some kind of event. And so those expense categories are going to look a bit lower. All right, so regardless of the thoughtful budget projections you've done, there likely will come a time when you want to solicit additional funding, whether that's as part of a fundraising campaign and an appeal to a donor or a foundation or some kind of external funder, or whether you're making an internal request of your boss or budget officer. Knowing how to write a funding proposal is the fourth and final part of the toolkit, and this is an important skill to refine. I find it helpful to think of the funding proposal as a quick hit of information. The intention is to provide the funder the information they need to consider your request, and sometimes no further conversation is needed. But more likely, the proposal is a jumping off point, either for negotiating the amount of money or the scope of what you're asking for. So first, I'll share the strategies that I've used for writing a proposal for an external funder, like a donor. You want to first talk with your development officer or the person responsible for fundraising to be sure that what you're wanting to ask for fits within their priorities. And if it doesn't, you likely won't be able to move ahead. So knowing that sooner rather than later is helpful. If what you're asking for does fit with their priorities, you'll want to work closely with that staff member to craft the proposal. Personally, I like working up a draft first and then getting feedback from the development officer as opposed to workshopping a blank sheet of paper, but it's really your personal preference. I typically divide these proposals into four types of information. So first, the background. I like to describe what the current state of things are. For example, I've written a proposal to get a new HVAC system. And so I included a couple of examples of how the current system was failing and how that was negatively impacting collections and thereby negatively impacting research and learning possibilities. The second part is the scope. So what is it that you're actually asking for and how much is it going to cost? With that HVAC system, it was a pretty straightforward kind of big dollar amount. There wasn't much to break down. But if you're launching a new program or some kind of initiative, there may be really specific parts of the budget you want to outline and explain to this potential funder. If there are alternatives to what you're proposing, you want to include that as well. And so that would be the third section of information that you convey. So maybe you want to find funding for a new student assistantship or internship program, but in your conversations with this external funder, you know that they're only going to support maybe 1 year of that program, and then the library will have to pick up the tab for subsequent years. So you want to include that kind of framing as part of your alternative. Or maybe you know that the donor has a lot of different interests, and so you want to present them with several different projects that they could choose to fund at different dollar amounts. And again, your budget officer is a great partner in this work because they'll likely know what that donor might be interested in. And then finally, the timeline. Sometimes when we're asking for more money, we don't have a definite timeline in mind, but sometimes we do. And so if you have a particular project with a particular deadline, you want to be sure that that information is in the proposal. So when writing a proposal for your boss or budget officer, it's a bit different, but I include those same 4 pieces of information. Your boss, and to a lesser extent, your budget officer, shares your same background to a degree. You know, we all work in a library, and so they have that kind of baseline of information. But still, I tend to shy away from jargon. So I come from special collections land, and just like all aspects of librarianship, we have a lot of jargon. But I tend to avoid abbreviations and things that other people are probably just not going to know, even though we all work in the same profession. And so, of course, you want to strip out any jargon from your donor proposals, your external funding proposals, but certainly even with your boss or budget officer, you just want to be mindful of the amount of jargon that you're using. And hopefully at this point, you've gotten to know your boss and budget officer a little bit, and you know how they like to receive information. Maybe they prefer bullet points to a narrative or vice versa. Maybe they're going to want to have a conversation as they review the proposal, so you'll want to set up a meeting. And then you'll also want to consider what their values are and how you can maybe connect what you're trying to do with those values. So for example, I worked with a budget officer who talked and thought a lot about return on investment, or ROI. And so when talking to this person and sort of creating proposals or running ideas by him, I would frequently frame my work with that ROI value kind of built in. Whenever possible, I try to keep these proposals to 1 page or less. Again, the intention is to give them the highlights, not a lot of detail at this point. But of course, you should be prepared to talk through the detail as questions arise. Once you send in the proposal, you want to think about what your next steps are. If you're sending the request to a foundation or an individual donor, your development officer is likely to be the person to follow up. But if you're submitting this request internally to your boss or a budget officer, you may need to be the one to push for that follow-up. If you receive the funding, be sure and figure out what your communication plan is going to be to your team as well as externally as needed, and also how you're going to track that spending just like you did with your regular allocation. And of course, don't be disappointed if you're not successful right out of the gate. If possible, work with your development officer or ask your boss or budget officer why your proposal wasn't funded. Maybe priorities have shifted, maybe the financial landscape has changed since you submitted it. And so you want to understand that why, because that'll help you to strengthen proposals that you write in the future. All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground this afternoon, and I hope that you'll leave this session feeling more confident about how to manage budgets and participate in the budget-related conversations at your own institutions. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, please don't shy away from asking questions about where your money is and what it can be spent on and why. Those answers are key, and they will set you up for success as you continue your own budgeting quest. My contact info is here on the screen, and I'm happy to take your questions.
All right, thank you so much, Lori. That was an excellent presentation. And yes, now is the time for questions. So if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and we're going to answer them in the order in which they came in. Looks like we've got 9 questions so far, so we're going to try and get through what we can. I'll keep copies of the questions so you can look at them later, Lori, if you want. Okay, for our first question, how can managers foster equity in budgeting in terms of sharing information about spending and budgetary constraints, especially to be able to share information with our direct reports, knowing what's flexible, et cetera?
It's a great question. So I think a key piece to that for me, especially during COVID times when the budget picture was looking either bleak or just really uncertain, is to be very clear about what's in your control as someone managing a budget and what's outside of your control. And that can help to alleviate some concerns. But I feel like I may be missed the first part of the question. Katrina or Christine, I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part?
Yeah, the first part was how can managers foster equity in budgeting in terms of sharing information about spending and budgetary constraints?
Right. So I think just that transparency piece. You know, at the end of the day, we are stewards of someone else's money, or at least that's how I tend to think of it. And we're going to do the best that we absolutely can, but we all work within constraints. I often think that we will never have enough money. We will never have enough people to do the work that we want to be doing, or perhaps even that's expected of us. So being clear about that from the get-go. And then if you find yourself that you're having to make cuts, you want to be really clear about why that's happening and to do your best to protect the folks on your team from the negative fallout of that. We can't always do that. Absolutely. That's certainly true. But to be really clear about why something's happening. And I think sometimes it's really easy to blame when it comes to this sort of situation. And I don't find that very constructive. I mean, if there is a true reason, you want to provide that. But just saying, you know, oh, central administration doesn't care about us anymore, I'm not sure how productive that is. So I tend to try to keep those conversations as productive and action oriented as possible. What can we do? What's within our control?
Yeah, great points. All right, so our next question is, do you have suggestions for asking for help from the budget officer when there is widespread institutional gatekeeping? No one shares info because mystery equals job security.
Sure, and maybe that's some of what I've encountered, and I just haven't thought about it that way. So I think doing your homework as much as you're able to do. So the conversation that I described with that development officer, for example, I had already spent a couple of months doing as much kind of digital forensics as I could in terms of putting together the information that I was able to have access to. And then I kind of sought out guidance. So that's something to just be mindful of. You want to do your homework first. And I think something else to consider is, where is this kind of gatekeeping having a negative impact on you and the work that you've been asked or tasked to do? Because explaining to someone, you know, by not having this particular piece of information, this is the direct negative impact on me or my team, and this is the result. that can often be more effective than just a blanket, tell me everything I need to know about the budget, but to be as concrete as possible, which takes a lot of time. Someone earlier was commenting in the chat how much time it takes to manage budgets proactively, and it certainly does. But I think if you can be specific with that person and explain what that inactivity is resulting in for you, my hope would be that that person would see that there's benefits to sharing information.
Agreed. I like your suggestion of being as concrete and specific as you can. I think that's really good advice. All right, our next question. What if you have incomplete information about what you can and cannot spend money on and are not given transparent information about the process of understanding? How can you develop priorities without misleading your team about what is possible?
Sure. Well, there's the old do it and ask forgiveness later trope that comes to mind, but I mean, I think you want to try to get that information first. If you're not dealing with an endowment or with a gift fund, there is unlikely to be those sorts of stipulations. So if you are dealing with an endowment or a gift fund, that documentation should be somewhere. Although I have discovered that it wasn't always best practice to actually keep written documentation of these stipulations. If that's the case, then you want ideally to get in writing from your boss or some other administrator that we don't actually know what the stipulations are, and so we are agreeing to spend it in this way for either this year or for this term of years, so that you have some coverage if something kind of goes off there. But again, I think just being clear with your team that you don't know this and this is your best guess. And if you're told something's wrong, that you'll make that change going forward. I take great comfort in the fact that we operate on a fiscal year, a year-to-year basis. I know we do long-term planning. I certainly do as well. But if we make a mistake this year, we can make adjustments hopefully in future years.
Yeah, and I think what you said there about telling your team that you just don't know, I think admitting that you don't know can be a great act of transparency, because at least then there's an answer about something.
Yeah.
All right, so our next question asks, is the overall academic library budget shared with staff? I used to get regular updates at my old place of work, but not at current. To practice radical transparency, this information, I believe, should be disclosed to staff, especially at a public institution. Thoughts?
Absolutely, 100% agree. So I've worked at public and private institutions, and I think that while public institutions may err towards transparency because they have to in certain ways, the first private I worked at, our dean of libraries was incredibly transparent about the budget. And that's kind of where I take my cue from. So I think, again, working within your sphere of influence to be as transparent as you can be with your team. And we're talking about dollars and cents. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you share the stipulations of all these endowments and gift agreements with everyone. You don't have to do that. In fact, there are reasons why you shouldn't. But it's about what money you have available. People may not care a lot about where it's coming from. Maybe they do, and there could be good reasons for that. But yeah, I think working within your sphere of influence, and truth be told, now I'm thinking about my current institution, and I don't know if we've had that conversation at an all-staff meeting. It was part of the culture at our previous institution to do that. And people absolutely felt really appreciated that.
Yeah, and I think the next question in our list kind of relates to this. It asks, how far down the hierarchy should sharing around the budget go?
All the way. I think anyone who works full-time in your organization, and there would be benefits also to people who don't work full-time. There really should be no secrets here. I struggle to find the benefit of keeping this information under one's hat. And I also think, even with students, if you're in a situation where you've worked with a student for a couple of years or a couple of semesters, and you're looking down the line to the new fiscal year and you don't know that you'll be able to bring them back, be honest about that. Communicate that to them. Make sure you know that it's not them, it's you, and your situation may be different. I like to be really upfront with students because, of course, in some ways they're they're certainly more vulnerable employees than others. And so making sure that they know what's happening. And then in terms of students actually being kind of clients of the library, having them understand how much money we spend on the resources, what it takes to actually run an organization. There's real benefit to that. So yeah, I believe as far down the hierarchy as you can. Absolutely.
I agree with you 100%. All right. Our next question is, any suggestions on communicating to the broader campus about resource changes due to changes in collections budgets?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I think this falls under the early and often communication strategy. I think I should say I have never directly been involved with this. My collections budget has always been a bit different, working in special collections. But what I have observed is that sometimes folks in the library want to keep this kind of, again, under wraps. And then faculty inevitably find out because people like to talk. And then you're trying to do some damage control, and that's where things can really go wrong. So I would imagine that if you're a subject specialist, subject liaison, be having those conversations with your faculty. You know them the best. You know your departments the best. You should know what they need to do, the research and the teaching that they're doing. And so if you're anticipating, a cut or some other kind of impact coming down the pike, talking with their department head if you can, or maybe going to a department meeting. And again, being clear with what you don't know, but this is kind of where things are headed. Or going with your, collection development manager, or going with another administrator. So it's not just you. But again, communicating early and often about what's happening would be important. Yeah, I'm looking at the chat, Charlotte. I think that's an interesting comment. And I think that gets into the messaging. So we're about to change to Alma next week. We actually go live with a new catalog. And I've been really impressed with how our communications team has been working with our library, the rest of our library staff, to put out proactive messaging about that particular change. It's not related to the budget, but it's a way of partnering with another unit within the library who can help you on that kind of messaging. And so your comment about blame, I think that comes down to the messaging and how we talk about it.
Yeah, all good points. All right. So our next question is, sometimes it feels like everyone in the library is competing against other units for budget funds. How can library leadership ensure that funds are allocated in an equitable manner across the library?
Yes, thank you so much for raising this question. I am so fortunate right now to be part of an institution that there is not that kind of competition. Not to say we don't have competing needs, but I am so fortunate to be part of an administrative team that actually works as a team. And so I for a moment forgot that unfortunately that is not the situation everywhere. And I've certainly experienced it where there is that kind of competition. So I think you want to be sure that your administrator, whoever that person is, knows what your needs are, and again, knows the impact of what you're asking for will have on the mission. So being able to connect back to the values of the organization, to the mission of the library, and things like that is important. If you find yourself as an administrator who is in that competition, I think, perhaps asking yourself, is that kind of culture benefiting you or others? And if it's not, if you're in a position to try to shift it, which I recognize is like moving a mountain, what can you do? And maybe it's about, so February tends to be the time where I start putting my budget together for the next fiscal year. And that gives me plenty of time to have conversations with different people throughout the organization. What I didn't do this year, though, was to share that information with my fellow administrators. I talked with my boss and my budget officer, but I actually didn't share that with my peers, and I should have. And so being transparent within your peer group, I think, can also go a long way, because maybe there are opportunities to cost share, or maybe there are opportunities to bring some efficiency to the operation. But if everyone stays in their silo, that opportunity is lost. So communication as you're comfortable. And I recognize that in some cultures, that kind of transparency is not rewarded. So you want to take care of yourself as well.
Definitely. All right, we've got 3 questions left. We've got about 5 minutes, and I think we can get through them. Lori, you give wonderfully detailed yet succinct answers. So the next one is advice on working with the budget officers when they consistently leave library leadership out of budget communications, and how to get them to allow library expenditures when they don't value the library's impact on students.
Oof. So I think it depends on your context. So it sounds like this person doesn't have a budget officer in their library, or at least I hope not, if that's the question. So if that's the case, then I think you want to figure out who in your organization is supposed to be the liaison to the central budget office, and that's probably your dean or director. But if this is an internal issue where your library director or your budget officer in the library doesn't think you should be spending money on things or doesn't see the value, I think, again, maybe having a frank conversation with your boss about what the impact of that negative view is, or that lack of communication and facilitation might be helpful. Feel free to email me. I put my email in the chat, but I will again, because I feel like this is a big question and I don't want to give it short shrift.
All right, so the next one is, how do you think about funding one-time or temporary positions with the idea that you will find more money later? My library does this a lot, and it often leads to unsustainable positions. Is it better just not to hire until you have confirmed years of funding?
Oh, great question. Great question. I think it depends. So in special collections and archives, we have a penchant for hiring project archivists. And so these are contract positions, 1, 2, or 3 year positions. And that part of the profession has really started to shift away from that model because, and I agree. So if you're trying to meet a core operational need, like making collections available for research, that has to be on hard funding, at least as far as I'm concerned. So I think of soft funding, which is what's being described in this question. So short-term funding. I think of that as kind of, maybe you're trying to pilot something. So for example, we have a library residency program, and the current resident will be looking at digital publishing. And that's something we haven't explored fully as an organization. And so this person will be helping us to decide how we might go about that work. But I would hope that if we decide to make that a permanent part of our library services and program, that we would hire or reallocate staffing to do that. So I think it really comes down to whether what you're trying to fund is a core operational need, or whether this is perhaps a short-term need, in which case maybe you don't need to project out your spending for years and years at a time.
Excellent. And let's go ahead and look at our very last question before we wrap up. I think we can do it. This one comes from Emily Clasper, and she asks, I feel like a big factor in determining our budgetary wants versus needs should lie in our values, ensuring that the things we spend on promote equity, sustainability, etc. How do you ensure that this doesn't get lost in the dollars and cents?
Great point. Thank you so much for raising that. Absolutely. So I think that comes out in the conversations that you have with your team. So that can be part of figuring out what those categories are, what those expense categories are, and then actually figuring out, okay, what goes in each of those categories. And absolutely, within our organization, we have a lot of conversations about, how does this particular thing relate to our values? How are we operationalizing our values? And I think the budget and how we choose to spend it is a really important place to be having those conversations. So thank you so much for raising that.
All right, and that is the end of our time. So thank you again, Lori, for answering these questions. I'm really impressed that we got through all of them. And thank you so much for the great presentation. It was an absolute delight to have you with us. And before we close the session, I want to point out the evaluation survey that is available for you to complete. I'm certain that Lori would very much appreciate your feedback. You can find a link to the evaluation in Schedule. It's labeled feedback survey and is directly above the session description. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you've enjoyed this presentation.